Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Wiley Harris, and today I'll be presenting an overview of the crossbow in the Middle Ages, along with my group mates Will Brown and Rowan Martin. Over the next few minutes, I'll trace the crossbow's journey from its origins in ancient China to its dominance in medieval Europe. We'll look at how this weapon transformed warfare through mechanical innovation, reshaped social hierarchies, and even provoked moral debate within the church. In short, the crossbow story is one of technology meeting society, a moment when engineering began to rival nobility and training as a source of power. A brief introduction. When crossbows first appeared, it was considered revolutionary for a simple reason. It changed who could fight effectively. Traditional longbows demanded years of practice and significant physical strength. By contrast, a crossbow could be mastered fairly quickly, and its mechanical trigger let ordinary infantrymen launch bolts with enough force to pierce a knight's armor. As historian Mark Cartwright notes, this was a major democratization of warfare. A peasant armed with a crossbow could now match or even surpass the lethality of a trained noble warrior. The weapon was also versatile. It could be fired from castle walls in open battle or even aboard ships. This flexibility reshaped both battlefield tactics and social power structures. Over the course of the Middle Ages, the crossbow became a symbol of this shift, technology empowering the many while unsettling the few who once controlled violence. The early origins of the crossbow. To understand its later impact, we need to begin in ancient China, where the first true crossbows were developed. The earliest written references date to around the 6th century BCE, when Shi of the Chu state is said to have invented a trigger-based bow. By the Warring States period, 403 to 221 BCE, crossbows were widely developed. Archaeological discoveries from the Terracotta Army tombs revealed just how advanced these weapons were. Researchers found more than 40,000 bronze arrowheads and numerous trigger mechanisms, each nearly identical in design. This points to a highly organized system of mass production, an early example of standardized mechanical engineering. The Chinese recognized both the practical and philosophical implications of the crossbow. The character for trigger, in Chinese, ji, also meant the pivotal moment or opportunity. Pulling the trigger symbolized the instant when potential became action, the moment when a small motion could determine life or death at a distance. In military terms, Chinese commanders used crossbows mainly for defensive warfare or ambush tactics. Units stationed on walls or flanks could release precise, powerful volleys that halted cavalry charges or advancing infantry. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, the crossbow had become the backbone of Chinese armies. A surviving Han bronze trigger in the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows just how refined these mechanisms were: compact, durable, and efficient. In short, the Chinese didn't merely invent a new weapon, they created an enduring model of mechanical discipline and standardized warfare, ideas that would re-emerge in Europe more than 1,000 years later. The crossbow's origin in Europe. The path from East Asia to Europe remains debated. Some historians believe crossbow technology traveled westward along early trade routes. Others suggest independent European innovation. What we know for certain is that similar devices appeared in the Greek world as early as the 4th century BCE. For example, the gastrophetes, or literally belly bow, described by L. Sprague de Camp, function on the same principle: a stock, a composite bow, and a mechanical release. Later, the Romans adapted the idea into torsion-powered engines like the manuballista and arqueballista. These could launch heavy bolts or stones and were used in sieges throughout the empire. After the fall of Rome, however, Europe lost much of this mechanical knowledge for several centuries. It wasn't until around the 10th century CE that crossbows resurfaced, and when they did, they quickly became one of the most defining weapons of the medieval world. The crossbow's reappearance in Europe. The crossbow re-entered European history dramatically. Chronicles described its use in Lothair's invasion of Verdun in 985, marking its first confirmed reappearance after antiquity. By the 11th century, its reputation spread across the continent. The most famous early use came during the Norman conquest of England. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror's forces employed crossbows whose steady volleys helped break the Anglo-Saxon shield walls. The Bayeux Tapestry vividly portrays these soldiers crouching behind their weapons, a powerful image of the mechanical replacing the heroic. From that point on, the crossbow's popularity exploded. By the 12th century, nearly every major European army fielded crossbow units. Urban militias and mercenary companies relied on them because they required minimal training compared to the longbow. This shift had profound social consequences. For centuries, the mounted knight had been the symbol of marital supremacy. Now, a common soldier with a mechanical trigger could threaten that hierarchy. As warfare professionalized, the crossbow became a tool of state power, mass-produced, standardized, and deadly efficient. It marked the beginning of Europe's move from the age of heroic combat to the age of organized armies and mechanical precision. In the next section of this presentation, we'll look more closely at how this new weapon actually worked, how it was engineered, and why it became both admired and feared across the medieval world. How do you stop?
Good afternoon. My name's Will, and I'll be taking over for Wiley. We'll start with how the crossbow worked. Now that we've explored where the crossbow originally came from, let's take a closer look at how it actually worked, because its mechanical design is what truly set it apart. A traditional bow relies on the archer's own strength to draw and hold the string before release, but the crossbow separated those two actions, drawing and holding, by using a mechanical trigger system. The basic design consisted of 5 key parts: the stock, also called the tiller, which formed the body of the weapon; the prod, or bow, mounted horizontally at the front; the string, stretched across the prod; and the trigger and nut mechanism, which locked the string into place; and the bolt, a short, thick arrow called a quarrel. To fire it, the user placed a foot in the stirrup, drew the string back until it locked into the nut, set a bolt on the groove, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The effect was stored mechanical energy, the first true example of a handheld tension weapon that used the trigger to release power. As the Metropolitan Museum of Art describes it, the crossbow was essentially the medieval rifle, a precision device designed for accuracy and repeatability, not brute strength. This innovation, translating muscle power into a stable mechanical system, made it one of the most important technological milestones of the Middle Ages. Here's a brief video of how the crossbow worked. You can see the hook pulling back the string on a single-handed windlass crossbow. It pulls it all the way back until the nut mechanism. The string then holds there and waits for the arrow to be placed. The arrow is then fired off. And then the crossbow resets with the hook going back to the string and repeating the process. Next, we talk about the crossbow spanning devices in Europe. As European crossbows evolved, they became stronger, but that also made them harder to draw by hand. Early versions could be cocked manually, but later models used steel prods that required hundreds of pounds to draw weight. That's where spanning devices came in, tools that use physics to amplify human strength. The simplest was the stirrup and belt hook method. The shooter braced the crossbow with a foot in the stirrup, hooked the string with a metal hook attached to their belt, and straightened their legs to pull it back. When large stationary composite and metal crossbows became more popular through the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, the windlass became crucial for spanning. The windlass, fitted onto the stock, worked by rotating 2 handles connected to a pulley system with claws placed over the bowstring, utilizing mechanical advantage to draw the string. However, the windlass was slow and cumbersome to use, resulting in its utilization in siege warfare rather than open battlefields. The crankin was a similar spanning device to the windlass, appearing sometime in the late 14th century. It was a small, geared, ratchet device mounted directly on the stock with hooks placed over the string. The rotating handle would turn a gear, drawing the string. These devices represented the height of medieval craftsmanship. They required fine metalwork and precise gearing, skills that would later influence clockmaking and early industrial design. These mechanical aids didn't just make the weapon stronger, they symbolized the fusion of science and warfare, showing how human ingenuity could overcome physical limits through engineering. Types of medieval crossbows: the simple hand, composite, and the arbalist. By the late Middle Ages, there were several types, of which we just listed previously. Each were designed for specific purpose or social context. The simple wooden crossbow was light, practical, and used by foot soldiers and militias. These were often made by local craftsmen and used for short-range combat. Next came the composite crossbow, which combined materials like horn, sinew, and wood, similar to Eastern designs introduced through contact with Islamic armies during the Crusades. This gave the weapon greater flexibility and power for its size. The most famous and powerful form was the arbalist, a steel crossbow capable of penetrating plate armor. Its prod could require over 1,000 pounds of tension, making it one of the most lethal ranged weapons before the age of gunpowder. Types of medieval crossbows: the hunting and sporting crossbow, and slurbow. There were also specialized hunting crossbows, highly decorative and used by nobles. Some featured ivory inlays, etched steel, or gilded mechanisms, turning the weapon into a status symbol rather than a battlefield tool. Finally, the slurbow, an early 16th century design, enclosed the bolt in a metal track and used a levered trigger system, blurring the line between crossbow and early firearm. Each design reveals the evolution of craftsmanship and social function, from peasant weapon to aristocratic sport, from tool of war to object of artistry. Use and tactics. Crossbowmen commonly worked in teams made up of a shooter, loader, and pavice bearer. The pavice bearer usually held a spear and planted the pavice, a large rectangular shield big enough to stand behind. The team would have 2 or more crossbows, and the shooter and loader would alternate crossbows, allowing for continuous fire. The Genoese crossbowmen, a famous military corps in the Middle Ages, commonly utilized this strategy. Crossbows were particularly suited for siege warfare, where the protection offered by castle walls and siege engines allowed crossbowmen to reload safely. They were employed for sharpshooting, to support or repel assaults, and to fire incendiary projectiles. On open battlefields, infantry crossbows were deployed against cavalry and infantry shot in volleys. Crossbowmen also fought from battle carts that were arranged to form circular fortresses. Additionally, crossbows were utilized by mounted soldiers forming part of light cavalry. Naval warfare also implemented crossbowmen that used a combination of siege and battlefield tactics, including sharpshooting, incendiary projectiles, and volley formations.
My name's Rowan, and I'll be taking over for Will. Major medieval battles involving crossbows. By the High Middle Ages, the crossbow had become a defining weapon on Europe's battlefields. It was feared for its power, admired for its precision, and often decisive in the outcome of wars. One of the earliest major battles where crossbows played a key role was the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The Battle of Hastings marked the crossbow's introduction to England as a sporting and military arm. It was used by the Norman invaders under William the Conqueror and proved effective at disrupting shield walls. During the Crusades, both Christians and Muslims forces adopted crossbows for siege warfare. At the Siege of Jerusalem, 1099, chronicles described bolts so numerous that the skies seemed darkened, a wild, vivid image of how the weapons dominated defensive and offensive combat alike. The Battle of Cursory in 1346 is perhaps the most famous. Here the French relied on Genoese crossbowmen, professional mercenaries famed for their skill. However, heavy rain soaked their bowstrings before combat, weakening their shots. The English longbowmen, whose strings had been kept dry, responded with devastating volleys. The defeat was catastrophic for the Genoese and revealed both the strength of limitations of the crossbow, lethal when properly used but vulnerable to the elements and slower to reload. And finally, in 1453, at the siege of Constantinople, crossbows appeared side by side with the earliest cannons and handguns. This marked the symbolic transition from the medieval world of tension and string to the modern world of powder and shot. We will now talk about the church ban and why it happened. However, the rise of the crossbows did not come without controversy. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent II, issued one of the most striking prohibitions in military history. The council condemned the use of crossbows, and longbows as well, against Christians and Catholics, calling them deadly and hateful to God. Why? The church viewed the crossbows as a violation of both moral and social order. It allowed a peasant or a common soldier to kill a noble knight from afar, undermining the traditional hierarchy that had defined Christian warfare for centuries. The weapon's mechanical impersonality, his ability to deliver death without the close combat, was also seen as spiritually troubling. And yet, despite the decree, the ban was almost immediately ignored. European monarchs recognized the crossbow's effectiveness, especially against armored opponents, and continued to employ it widely. The church even approved its use in the Crusades, where the ban did not apply to infidels. The moral double standard highlights the deep tension between religious ideals and military necessities during the Middle Ages. The crossbow after the church ban. Despite the church's attempt to suppress the crossbow, the ban had little lasting effect. In fact, within a generation, the European rulers and city-states were using the weapon more widely than ever before, practically outweighing piety. The crossbow was simply too effective to abandon. By the 13th century, nearly every major European army fielded professional crossbow units. These soldiers, known as arbalesters, were paid specialists often equipped with standardized weapons produced in royal armies. Cities like Genoa, Venice, and Bruges even formed crossbow guilds, blending civic pride, martial skill, and craftsmanship. In these guilds, the crossbow became not only a weapon but also a symbol of civic identity and technological mastery. Ironically, the same weapon once declared hateful to God became a central feature of Christian warfare, used to defend castles, guard merchant ships, and fight crusades. The contradiction reflects the core tension of Middle Ages, a society torn between moral ideals and technological necessities. The Church's condemnation, rather than ending the crossbow's legacy, only highlights how innovation cannot be contained by decree. In many ways, the crossbow's continued use after the ban reveals the beginning of a new relationship between religion, technology, and authority, one that would define Europe for centuries to come. The decline in legacy. Despite its remarkable history, the crossbow eventually gave way to a new force. That was gunpowder. By the 16th century, early firearms, arquebuses, and matchlocks could deliver great power, faster reloads, and better armor penetration. They required even less training than crossbows, allowing monarchs to field large, inexpensive armies. Still, the influence of the crossbows lived on. Its trigger, stock, and slight mechanisms directly inspired early gun design. As historian Arnold Blumberg notes, the crossbow represents the bridge between medieval and modern warfare, a transition from the heroic and personal to the industrial and impersonal. In art and culture, the crossbow also remained a potent symbol. It appears in paintings, tapestries, and museum collections as an emblem of precision, ingenuity, and human adaptation. Even today, its quiet accuracy makes it a favorite hunting weapon, a peaceful echo of its violent past. The crossbow's true legacy is not only in the battles it won, but in the ideas it transformed. The notion that human invention could amplify and perhaps outpace human mortality. Conclusion. To conclude, what does the story of the crossbow teach us? It teaches us that every technological innovation reshapes not only warfare, but society itself. The crossbow embodies the intersection of engineering, power, and also ethics. From its birth in ancient China to its dominance in medieval Europe, it represented the growing ability of humans to extend force through mechanics. It changed the authority of knights, unsettled the moral teachings of the church, and laid the foundations for modern military science. The crossbow turned strength into geometry, courage into precision, and the art of war into a matter of calculation. It was more than a weapon. It was a turning point, signaling the beginning of the modern relationship between human ambition and mechanical invention. Thank you.